Aperture.
There are a couple seats in the front row. If somebody's standing and doesn't want to, let me know if you can hear. My dear friend at Princeton, P. Adam Sitney, the film historian, went into the office, a rarity these days, just recently, and he said, "Oh, just tell them if you hadn't met Edith, they would never have heard of you." And I said, "P. Adams, that's my story." I said that. I was given the assignment to kind of go over the ground that I went over and use this image set that I used when I gave my sort of what Edith calls my graduation talk at Princeton. After those years there, Joel Smith wanted me to give a talk. And on a really wonderful rainy night, I think my brain did pull it all together. Things came out of nowhere. Always, I wished I didn't know what I was going to say. In truth, the life we live is the life we live. We know it all too well. But let me set the stage, and I don't see if I can do this and read at the same time. I found, as I was thinking about how could I change this, what could I do that's relevant and for me, well, this paper fell out of my notebooks the other night, and I thought, this is relevant. This sets the stage. I put my pictures together from things I don't understand. I put my thinking together from concepts that are less than clear. I put my phrases together with words whose meanings are less than certain. I don't see tables. I don't see chairs. I see only works of art. I have no alternative lifestyle. For me, every day is Sunday. The sorting out of our feelings gives an order. Another image can be made from the same parts. The more often we photograph the same thing, the less freshly we do it. A straight line in the right place can bring us to tears. Knowing what you're doing just increases the obligations. Watching someone else's troubles allows us to relax. Honor mother and father and leave home. A person in a hurry is like a key fitting only one thing. Nourishment is to live that which is unsayable, that which can't be formulated. Be more concerned with the quality of acts than the quality of art. Every time you do something really worthwhile, you need time to absorb it, to recover from the shock. So let me open my computer now and put an image on this screen. Is the light good for everybody? I like this level of light because I can see you. Is that too good? It's good thing I said that, huh? And I don't want to. So what I did that night at Princeton was just start in the beginning and try to, and I have to do this in 45 minutes, and Sarah's going to keep time for me and flash me a sign when we get to 10 minutes left, 5 minutes left, and then whew. But what I wanted to do that night was just retrace a life in photography. And this is where it begins for me, waiting for a dentist to have a tooth pulled. And as I was waiting, I was going through some magazines in the office, and I came across this picture. And I had what I realized was a completely natural response for me, because I'd grown up in a very staunchly Christian family. My father was a Methodist minister. I'd read the Bible 2 or 3 times by the time I was 12 years old. I didn't know much else about the world, but I did know that Bible pretty well. And on seeing this picture, you probably recognize it as Sierra Nevada, Ansel Adams, 1936, or 37 or 38, but you get the idea. And it just came out of me. I said, this is a Christ. This is an alternative Christ. Whatever dies makes way for whatever replaces it, that which is living. The cycle of resurrection is endless. And it struck me so strongly that I went home that evening and asked my father to borrow the family camera. I had no consciousness of photography at all. I never particularly had an interest in the family doings with the camera, but something, a concept, which was so powerful, it's like something beyond what you can say something about, had penetrated my consciousness. So I actually carried my father's camera for a couple of months until I actually found a burned tree and young grass going in front of it, and I made the picture. So I understood very well from the very first gesture within photography that images are about images. And Frederick Sommer, who wrote those notes, or who gave those notes as seminars, they were actually broken fragments of speech when I put them together in that shape, said, we don't have a pure thought of our own. Everything we know is just a reflection of what we've experienced in the world. Well, I understood that because that's exactly what drew me to look unconsciously until I found the burned tree stump and the young grass and replicated the image. This is images about images. So these, there's a hidden piece of time here. This is from 1957 roughly to 1961. It's a little chunk of time. High school, business school, and then finally art school. And these are among those first pictures, 1962, 63, 64. And it's the kind of image I organized into my senior thesis as a design student, which I didn't really understand at the time how fortunate we were to have people who were really fine artists as design teachers. Painting and drawing were really the backbone of the curriculum. And I organized in 1965 a set of 14 pictures, which I printed up. We had a project in senior year called 100 Book Project. And you had to make 100 copies by hand of something that you had produced yourself, and you had to correlate a text with image that somehow you took responsibility for and produced this. And I think the idea was that when you went for job interviews, you could give away one of these little books. I treasured my product from the beginning. I didn't give them away. They were for sale. $5. 14 original photographs dry mounted in to pages with text that I had stolen out of the Alfred Stieglitz memorial book, the 1937 American Portrait. Anyhow, and there's a footnote to this. 20 years after the fact, I'd come home one night and on my desk was a piece of graph paper. And it just like a wave came over me. Sit down and make a drawing because you're going to make the cover for your book. And I drew every day, so it was not a strange thing to do. But I wondered, why did the graph paper speak to me so poignantly? And telling the story in Virginia, where some of my teachers were there in the audience, one of them came up to me later and said, "You maybe don't remember, but you saw that one Sunday afternoon in my studio in 1964. And it's absolutely what Sommer was saying. We don't have a pure thought of our own, but we are image users. We we drink and breathe images. So my dear friend, my teacher, but dear friend also. I love the early years with Callahan, and I love the late years when we were both in Pace McGill Gallery in the 90s even. We would hear, "Oh, Harry's in town." I said, "Oh, I'll just sit here and wait until he comes in." And there would be other days I'd go in and there Harry would be, and he said, "I heard you were here. I just thought I'd just wait until you got here." He had such ways of letting me know where I stood. One of the first was, "I wonder if you'll ever learn to print." He said, and the terrible thing about it is I don't think we can teach you. You'll just have to figure it out. And I got to work, and I did some things. So many of his admonitions were poignant and sharp. For years, the graduates would meet on a Sunday night, and I always found myself the last to leave. And finally, after 2 years of this, he said, "I don't know what you're waiting for, but it's not here." And at the memorial service for Callahan at the Museum of Modern Art, I had to, maybe with a tear in my eye, I had to say, "Okay, Harry, you can't argue back now. You're gone." It was there. There was something there. There is something that passes between us that is beyond words. But words are also the vehicle for this understanding. There's a great Callahan image, and it's one of the things, I know as a young photographer, you set goals for yourself, and what is the quality of intimacy that we love in a picture? And this was a kind of gold standard in my mind. What it was as a young husband to watch my wife asleep at night while I would be working late into the night, turn around and see her off in the corner of the room asleep. What a marker of intimacy that is. Evans became a bit of a friend, Walker Evans. When I was digitizing these images for Princeton, I found things like this that I'd quite forgotten. But Evans was very important to me in many ways, not the smallest of which was that my closest friend in graduate school, Jim Dow, was Evans's printer for about 5 years and printed the big Museum of Modern Art monograph and show. And in that exchange, indirectly, some of the affection that I felt for Evans was, communicated. Another couple of heroes, but Ansel you might recognize in this picture, Ansel Adams. You might not recognize Frederick Sommer. They had such a curious and interesting relationship, and I never see this that I don't think of the truant who's been caught by the principal. Doesn't it? The occasion was a life's contribution to photography. Anyhow. If I had more than 45 minutes, there's so much to tell you from Sommer. A straight line can be as alive as the wildest arabesque or tender embrace. It's a question who tensions the straight line. Mondrian is as organic as Gaudí. Some people speak of a return to nature. I wonder where they could have been. When we were getting to know each other in the 60s, I was trying to arrange to have him come to Dayton, Ohio. And we were on the telephone, our first phone conversation. And I'm saying something about logistics and airplane reservations and who pay for what. And he said, that's so not interesting. We were just having a conversation and we came up with this little triplet of ideas. Watershed, light shed, guilt shed. Isn't that interesting? Light shed, watershed. Watershed we've got, but light shed and guilt shed. And he said, if you want to be an artist, that's the first job. I show you in particular this image of Somers, the amputated foot and leg. Often my students couldn't even look at this. I'd bring it in, adoringly and present it in class as an original print, or I'd show it as a slide, and they'd say, "Oh, change the picture. Don't make us look at this." But what happened for me was a connection with Leonardo da Vinci immediately came out of this picture before I actually knew who Frederick Sommer was. I knew very little about him as a person, but philosophically I felt myself almost instantly in kinship. Some backyard snapshots of Ralph Eugene Meatyard and Edith barbecuing hamburgers just days after he'd learned that he was dying of cancer. And does this look like a person who is self-consciously dying of cancer? Not at all. They're in their, Madeline and he are in the mask of the Lucy Bell crater enactment, which is an amazing series of pictures. It's one of the, I just think of Meatyard, not only because Meatyard connected to me early. I got a postcard from him weeks after arriving in Ohio saying, I heard you did a good thesis, send it to me. And in those days, people would say a thing like that, send me your thesis. And of course, I knew something about who Gene Meatyard was, so I said, okay. I don't know if I'd do that now, but Meatyard is an amazing artist for me. This image is a little over-illuminated in this form. The image is much darker than this. But looking at this one day with students, and it's funny how a picture can open for you weeks, months, years after you've known it. You sense that they're in a house that's been used as a barn. It's stored hay. And it's only after you sort of make peace with the idea that they're inside that you realize this house has no roof. And yet none of that's shown to you literally, but you feel it. Two images of the same person, Cranston Ritchie, who died of cancer, as parts of his body were amputated, stage by stage. I know I'll have to pick up the pace, but there are a few stories in the beginning that really do mark getting one's own voice. Callahan said to me, this maybe is your first picture. This is your first authentic, real picture. I had been drafted during the Vietnam era, 1965. I'd received my induction papers, report to Camp so-and-so in 3 weeks. And I took a deep breath and said, but I'm not interested in carrying a gun, and I'm not interested in shooting anybody, and I think I'm what they call a conscientious objector, but I don't exactly know what that is. And I went home to see about the draft. But just as an afterthought, before taking off to go fight the draft, I asked Callahan if I could borrow one of the school's 4x5 cameras. And he said, sure, and handed it to me. I said, oh, Harry, I'm sorry. I don't have any film holders and I don't have any film. He said, stop by the house. I stopped by. He handed me 5 film holders. He said, I'm not sure if they're loaded, but if they're loaded, maybe it's +X. You see how hopeless that is. And I could have checked. I knew what the notch code was for plus X, but I didn't, because I was going home to save my life. I mean, I was not going to Vietnam. I would have done a lot of things, but that was not one of them. I get finished with the draft board, and there was a bunch of ladies, and my whole life has been filled with wonderful women. So I have this sort of enlarged heart towards women. Well, I'm married to the best one, but and these women in the draft office seemed to understand where I was coming from. I went home that night quite liberated and started photographing a niece that I had never met before. And this little niece, who was much younger, watched all of this very longingly. And that night she pulled herself up in my lap and she said, "You sure did take a lot of pictures of that girl this afternoon." She said, "Now, tomorrow I'm going to think of some really good ideas and you're going to want to take pictures of me all day." And of course, I thought she'd forget. In the morning, she said, "Okay, here's my box of dolls. This is our first project." So what I'm saying is, you can be in the best mood in the world and make a bad picture. You can be in an awful mood and make a good picture. It has nothing to do with your intentions. There is a relationship between form and image and the deep possibilities of art. When our feeling is lucid, structure is art. And when I go back over the writing of Sommer and the things he said, I am astonished at the number of times he talks about the discrepancy of weights. And he's talking about pictorial weights, pictorial balances, equilibriums, tensions across the film plane. So I had 5 holders. I made all 10 negatives, not knowing there was film in the film holders. I was so excited I stopped off in Richmond to develop the film. There was film. It was plus X. You're lucky. And yet I knew that this situation had been delivered to me by forces beyond my control, having nothing to do with concept or choice or preference. And I came at a very early age to feel that just as my encounter with the resurrection, which is going on around us every day, and what it is that we could open ourselves to that was worth a picture or that had the potential of a picture. In fact, as Wendell Berry says, there are no unsacred places. There are only sacred places and desecrated places. It's not that there is unsacred. Anyhow, I printed this up and a couple weeks later showed it to Callahan. His remark, a few days after this, he said, "There's really no difference between us except I've made more bad pictures than you have. Of course, I've made more good ones too." And we both laughed, and we thought we'd sort of got away with something. I have a Paul Strand story, but it's not for tonight. So I'm just going to run through some of these. One of the stories that Callahan told me was his experience of having a call from Edward Steichen, who was at the Museum of Modern Art then. And Steichen said, "Well, I'm in Chicago and I want to see your new work." And Callahan said, "Well, I'm really sorry, but I only have one picture from this whole year." And he says, "Never mind, get ready, I want to see it." And on showing it to Steichen, he said, "Well, maybe this was worth a year." And I treasured Callahan telling me that, but I couldn't understand then its relevance to my own life. Until just a year or two out of school, I had gone a whole summer and thought I had made nothing. And then I came across this negative, And I thought, okay, this is probably how I feel about this is how he felt. And that's what we share. That really is the kinship between artists. There isn't a picture in here that doesn't have some kind of a little story. She'd come to me one day while I was doing something else, and she had these eggs. She said, I've collected 2 eggs from the barn. Would you like to see? And I said, yes, I'd love to see. And I sort of took myself out from under the cloth, and as I did it, she went, see? She crossed her arms. And I thought, what taught her? What force crossed her arms? Is that being done by her mind, by her brain? How do we understand that? And Joseph Campbell says of the grass, he says every week you cut the grass, and after so long, the grass would just say, well, I give up. I'm just not going to do this anymore. You keep cutting me, I'm just going to stop. And my own example of this sort of dilemma is, if we had to understand how to digest food, we'd all starve. I mean, maybe there's one nutritionist in a million that can sort of offer some kind of an explanation, but it would be a kind of hocus pocus. Your body just takes care of this. This is the wisdom of the body. Acting, using us as its vehicle. In the 70s, there was a nice article in Newsweek, and they asked me, well, is there anything about your work that's special? You can't say anything like that. And I said, I don't know. Maybe in 100 years, people will say that Emmet made circular pictures. Maybe that will be somebody will say, that'll be the best thing they'll be able to think of. In my heart of hearts, I hope they can go deeper than that. This is the sort of the starting point for a fabulous story. I think because this text and this story is carefully articulated in the text for this book. I won't tell you all of the story, but as I was thinking about this the other night, and this man, Willie Cooper, was married to one of our favorite aunts, Edith's mother's sister, Maggie Cooper. At about age 40, she began to play Santa Claus for all the children. I'm going to abbreviate this. It was quite the drama because the costume was so terrible. The adults came up with this deal where they would turn off the lights when Santa came to the window, and Santa was outside the house and the children were inside in the dark, and Santa had a bell. If you needed a Pavlovian experiment, this is it. And these children did indeed salivate. But that's sort of one of the stories, but this is the sweeter, smaller, tender thing. Edith was talking to her. She must have been about 97. She died this summer at 103, almost 104. And while I photographed her in the 70s, my oldest son, Elijah, photographed her in the late 90s and into 2001 or so. And Maggie used to love to say to us, I'm Elijah's favorite model. And we loved that we had this kinship of having shared the life of this wonderful woman. Well, one day Edith says to her, Maggie, I'd stand here in the yard with you and talk all day, but I have to go iron a dress. And here's the 97-year-old. She says, wow, I haven't thought of this for 50 years. And she said, well, one night I was ironing a dress, and Bill said, come on to bed, I can't get to sleep. She said, Bill, just go to sleep. I'm ironing a dress. He said, okay, as soon as you're finished, come to bed. she started a second dress, then a third, and he keeps calling out, Maggie, come to bed. And she said, Bill Cooper, what in the world is wrong with you? Just go to sleep. What is wrong with you? He said, I don't have any place to put my hands. I can't go to sleep. There are lots of levels to all these things, but I love a story. I'm going to leave some things for you folks to ask questions about, but this is one of the strange elements of my tenure at Princeton University. Not only was I a lecturer for 20 years before I became a full professor. It's a strange route, but very sweet, and I don't discount any minute of it. It was absolutely the right place for me. But they knew their readers would get upset with this picture, so that every time they did an article about photography or me or the museum or something, and they needed a picture, they would use this picture, because they knew their alumni would go bananas. And I stand around sort of like coyly saying, well, just a few seconds before this, they were really fighting and they were really angry, and they got to that place where they could have hurt each other. Brother and sister can do this. They can hurt each other. And they went, we better not. And so while the picture seems to carry one message, it's rooted in a reality you could never know without the story. This Yorkshire sheep farmer, I practiced the two of them because I had one sheet of film. And I said, it's going to be 1 second exposure, and when I click the shutter, I want you to really be still. We did the practice run. Everything was perfect. So I took out the dark slide. As soon as the shutter clicked, the younger man turned his head. You can see it. He's rotated his head. And this is deep. This is also the wisdom body acting out of its own impulses. A person in the 60s and 70s never took a picture that wasn't over when you heard the click. In another century, in another time, a 5-second exposure would have been a commonplace. So it's important to learn from the experience of our images, the image making. A curator asked me about this picture, said, I think I know where you got the idea for this picture. Adrian van Ostade, the 17th century Dutch printmaker. I said, I thought you were going to mention my wife's sister. I thought maybe you knew my wife's sister, because she was the one who really had the idea for this. In our lives, I've only got you up to about 1973, so I'm just barely out of graduate school and just getting my own voice. But in some deep way, I knew that I was making my own pictures because they were coming directly out of experience itself. There was no concept or no project planned into the future that I was illustrating, but rather the children built a treehouse in the winter after the death of Rennie Boer. I'd gone up into that treehouse just to see what the view was. One board had fallen out of the treehouse wall, a solid wall, but about 12 feet off the ground. I smushed the camera up against the space where the one board was missing, and this is the view. This is also the second version of the death portrait of Rennie Boer that I took. It's the second version, but it's the first negative. And I had accidentally that summer, or that week, reloaded a film that had been made in Europe into a film holder again. And that's already enough. In fact, the confusion over the film holder still haunts me. I knew better than to load a film that was outside the foil packet. A foil packet that's open indicates somebody's been in there, and this is fresh films in the packet, the exposed films on the outside. I get in there and I find this sheet of film. And because intellectually I'd just broken the seal with my thumbnail, I thought this was a new box of film. It wasn't. There were 19 sheets that day. The first holder I picked up happened to be the one with the exposure already on it. This gets into metaphysics just a little too much, but I'll tell you anyhow. I'd taken this picture, and I started taking the camera part, and as I put it back into its case, it was an old 8x10 Eastman view camera. Somebody, I thought, had passed through the room that I was in, and I thought I was alone with this dead person, who had just moved her coffin so she would be in a good light and open the shades, all of which I knew were violations of some unwritten law of things you can do around dead people. And I literally turned around in the room and I said, who is there? And when I looked, of course there was no one there. And my sense is that some thought, some subconscious angel that I was of my own creation had passed through this space to warn me. And I literally said out loud to the empty room, okay, you don't have to do that again. I get it. And here's the summation or the summary of this thought. If in your life you are in a moment when something which is totally relevant to your meaning, to your life, to your purpose, to your feelings, don't turn away from it. Those minutes, moments, experiences do not return. They never repeat. Don't think that what you pass up today will come back in some other form tomorrow. All life is endlessly non-repeating, of course, as it repeats itself. So that wasn't the picture I intended to make. You may know that Frederick Sommer has a great portrait of Max Ernst, which is also a double something or another. He didn't intend to make that either. He had actually stored a spoiled piece of film in the corner of his darkroom. Weeks later, developed a film he didn't like, put it in the corner of the darkroom. Weeks later, picked up both at once, thinking it was a single sheet of film, and there it was. So, in some ways, we speak honestly only to our mistakes. When Sommer says this in another way, he says, only chance is fair. If we do something out of our willfulness, it's not nearly as fresh as what we do by chance. It's not that there isn't an element of willfulness in anything we do. We do what's appropriate to ourselves. This, too, is a kind of turning point, but I won't make much of it. It's a tree in Siena, Italy, 1975. After the death of two uncles and a favorite grandmother, it seemed to me that the family was disappearing as a subject. And it wasn't that there wouldn't be new family and ways of getting at that family, but I didn't really know what my new subject would be. And yet, as I look back on these now, they seem as true to me and as relevant. It's a life I did not lead, but it's a place I would love to have grown up in. It's a vista which I would like to have encountered every day. The beautiful city of Matera. And I just was talking to Jeff Hirsch, who works at PhotoCare, whose wife is from Matera, of all things. And he's saying how gentrified, how completely restructured this is. It's one of the world's like heritage sites. It's actually photographed from the ground, but I remember with some sense of foreboding that when I showed it to friends, they said, "Oh, he must have been in an airplane." And I could say, "Well, no, but I'd like to." I didn't really know what the airplane was going to be about, but I was already thinking, I'd already sort of investigated getting a Hasselblad with a motor drive, weighing two thoughts, so I could either make self-portraits or aerial photographs. I passed on the self-portrait part of the equation. Though this is from the ground, Mount St Helens in 1980 was another experience which whole cloth put in my lap, assigned to do a project for the state of Washington over the summer of 1980. Mount St Helens erupted that spring. And it just seemed to be the most exciting thing in the state at that year. You're saying 10 minutes, so I mean, okay. So at Mount St. Helens. No, I know. Petra. This is a survey, and the book is a survey, so if I don't get to the very end of this, it's, we'll all live. One of the really cool things was that in the very second class I taught at Princeton was a young woman who was later to marry King Hussein of Jordan, and said that she thought I should come to Jordan and could make some pictures there. And after a few visits, I realized that some of the things I was responding to very strongly, I had seen them as wood engravings in the back of my father's Bible when I was a child. This is in Turkey, a monastic cell, 1st century, early Christianity, which still interested me a lot. I turned that corner thinking I'd make a new picture of that rock. It was gone. Another reiteration of that principle. You think something is always there? No. Hanford, Washington State, where the uranium was enriched to make the first atomic bombs. I don't know if you know this, but there's a really interesting little sequence in the atomic bomb history. The first bomb was Trinity. That uranium came from Hanford. There was enough uranium to make a second bomb. That was the Hiroshima bomb. There wouldn't have been a Nagasaki bomb if it hadn't been that U.S. Rangers captured the German enriched uranium in Europe at the very last months of the war. And that uranium was rushed back to America and turned into the bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. This is the old abandoned airfield at Hanford. And it was something, I by mistake thought I had seen a missile silo from an airplane. I was wrong. But the question had never entered my mind before. It's the closest I ever came to a project in some ways. And I started asking questions. There were 1,000 missiles during the height of the Cold War. ICBM ballistic missiles pointed at 500 targets would have been the most in Russia, and these were missiles with 2, 3, and sometimes 10 warheads. You could have destroyed every square foot of the whole Earth with the missiles we had ready. There's actually an ICBM silo in Conrad, Montana. But on the way to learning about missiles, which seemed like a dark thing to want to learn about, these miraculous things would come into view under the airplane. I learned that you sit in the back seat because you're not driving, and what's on the left side or the right side is of equal value. It isn't just what you think. These are paper mill water treatment ponds. Toxicity of water is so great after you make paper that you have to treat the water for a period of time before it can be released, and it's still questionable. The trailer park abandoned on the San Carlos Apache Reservation. These things are all real things, and oddly, I feel like the picture has to speak to you out of its nature as a picture, that's it. Among the things that I learned to see while looking to learn something about the nuclear age was the huge impact of industrial scale agriculture. And for me, these things were both horrific and beautiful at the same time. So a lot of the criticism centered at that time about how dare you make something beautiful which is so awful. And I'm not thinking that I'm responsible for that. But there are lessons to learn. Every which way you turn, there's a lesson to learn. We'd gone to the Very Large Array, which is radio telescope in New Mexico, and saw this, which looks like something that could have been seen by the Very Large Array, deep space. There's a sweet story about this, but I'll just have to save it for another time, or you can get it out of the book. I want to quickly go through the two last sequences. The Nevada test site, photographed in 96, 97, after 10 years of corresponding with the Department of Energy and asking for permission and looking for a way around sort of deadfall or impasse. I asked the observer from the Department of Energy, am I the first person, the first individual, the first, well, I don't know what I said, but that was the sense I was trying to express. He looked at me with complete disbelief. He said, "You're not an individual." And I thought, wow, what's coming? He said, you are a university. Meaning, if you weren't connected to a university, you wouldn't be here. If you were just a single person, I'd ask him to help me identify some of these things, and this, I just intuitively, when I saw it, I knew what it was. It was where the young men from the atomic training school would hide in these trenches until the bomb would be detonated. Then you walk down to ground zero. Very few people at that time had any idea that there were as many above-ground tests in America as there were, or as many tests as there were. Above-ground test is one thing. I know that the experience of even just spending 2 hours over the test site, I thought I already had enough material for a book. And that's a strange sensation. These are mostly below-ground tests after the 1957, 59 transition. They were all underground tests. And it's a pretty powerful image to carry in your mind of a sphere of rock and earth being vaporized, creating a void deep inside the earth so that a great bit of the earth's crust slumps down into that void. I have a little puzzle here. This is the site of many of the above-ground tests. There were approximately 100 above-ground tests conducted in Utah. And it's no wonder the atmosphere is as radioactive as was radioactive then. I love this expression of Leonardo's, to be disciples of experience. And we're learning from everything. And I pose this question to you because it's not so often you can illustrate a thing like this. And I was there. I wanted this side of this crater, but I asked the pilot, fly around to the other side. I'm just curious what this must look like looking east. I'm looking west into the setting sun. What do you suppose this crater looks like in the shadow from the other side? You nailed it, didn't you? So it's only experience gives us these deep certitudes. This is the way nature works. A beautiful parabola, a circle casting a shadow which forms a parabola. Nestled into a parabola is a straight line. So I'm thinking things about new mythology, new concept of what life is for. After photographing the test site, you got to give me a couple more minutes here. I was both dreadfully sad and yet optimistic, and what I found myself caring about was something that I'd cared about when I was much younger. And it was the durability of the world as we know it. We may destroy this place. The insects, well, as E.O. Wilson says, somebody said, the insects will inherit the earth. He said, oh no, they already own it. And I started going to Panama, to Costa Rica, to Ecuador, Guyana Francaise, to learn something about tropical biology. And it's just one of the best learning experiences. When Sommer says that we work out of the need to educate our own feelings, this is exactly what was happening for me. These are sort of byproducts of that study, and I was trying to learn about nature, but Edith kept popping up. And in fact, it was great. Some years she couldn't go, so I'd take little cardboard cutouts of her along. So she was there in a kind of substitute way. And this is the project I've been working on almost 13 years now, 14 years. A book for children and scientists, portraits of insects, portraits of Mariposas nocturnus, moths. And I love that the biblical admonition against laying up treasures for yourself here on earth, you're supposed to lay up treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor dust doth corrupt, nor thieves break in and steal. It's like saying, stay away from the moths. That's just trouble. But I actually like them a lot. And I just made page number 50, so I hope to bring this out as a book in the next year. This that just seemed current, the show that's at Pace McGill right now. We love these pictures, made in less than 4 hours. Unbelievable. I can't believe it. And yet there's a precision in these pictures that's just breathtaking to me. And when I say precision, I'm just saying the structure of an image has to honor itself as a picture. Okay, this is the real coda. This will take just a second. Edith, I don't know how old you were there, and that's me as a Cub Scout, probably 8 years old. The first pictures of Edith, within weeks of getting my own camera as an art student. Stupidly having Edith pose in front of a sun lamp for about a half an hour, only to find that one side of her face was red and the other side was still white. Probably leading to the caution that made me use cutout cardboard instead of the real Edith as I was learning to make some of those tropical pictures. Us weeks after we were married. I don't know if we look happy here, but oh my God. That face still resonates. In the Gospel of Thomas, there's this admonition. It's one of the great sayings of Christ. The disciples are asking, what should we do? Should we eat special food? Do we have to dress a special way? Christ answers, do not lie and do not do what you dislike. Or in other translations, do not do what you hate. Further, Gospel of Thomas. When will the kingdom come, O Master? And Christ is supposed to say in this saying, and it occurs in other Gospels, the kingdom will not come by expectation. It will not be, look over there, there it is, look over here, here it is, maybe this is it, no, over there. So no, the kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth. It's only that people don't see it. So at Princeton, I apologize for the somber mood that I had depicted Edith in all our lives together, as if picture making was something extremely serious, and then life is this other thing, which is really typical of her and Jordan dancing for the children. So sort of, it's not equal time, but it is a kind of equal expression of joyfulness, which is really, when William Blake says that exuberance is beauty, I think he was talking about Edith. And these are these most current pictures. Edith conversing with Satan, or the altar figure of William Blake. There's a good story about that. And I said something about Maggie Cooper having died this year. Just at the last minute, spontaneously, I put in this picture, made about 3-4 weeks before she died. We'd come into the room, and we said, Maggie, do you know who it is? She said, of course I know who it is. Maggie, are you asleep? Well, I'm almost asleep. So this is the thing. Our ties to our family, our human ties to each other, are threads that can never be cut. It's what makes us what we are. We were talking about education earlier, and Stieglitz told Sommer, and evidently this was his favorite expression, when people would say to Stieglitz, what should I do in my work? And he said, and Stieglitz's answer was, continue to do what you're already doing. Okay, on that note, thank you. I think we were on press in 1990 with the Philadelphia Museum, and Richard Benson, who was a teacher for whom Robert Hennessy was a protege, and one of these people who learned how to take a picture apart and put it back together. And he was telling Hennessy, he said, no one else could have done this Philadelphia catalog but you. He's saying, I invented it, and I couldn't have done it. Anyhow, and they're passing compliments back and forth like this. And then out of nowhere, he says, oh my God, I got this Paul Strand story I have to tell you. Benson was giving us talk in New York, and Richard Avedon was in the audience. And Benson had worked as Paul Strand's printer for a number of years and was very close to Strand. And Avedon asked Benson, what portraiture do you think influenced Strand? Well, there's no answer to that. But Benson, in his little story to us, he said, well, I told him there was only one photograph by another photographer in his house, and it was a picture of Edith with him. The two color pictures?
Yeah. Are they
I think of it as an autumnal gift. Maffrey Foundation in Madrid. We had been working with them for 2 years to make this book an exhibition in Madrid, and they said, our budget is nothing this year. We can't buy pictures, but could you come over and make something new? And somehow maybe we'll find a little budget for that. And I said, that's great. We don't need to sell pictures. Let's do something new. And he'd said, I think I know something. This is the curator, Carlos Golinet. And he said, I want you to go to my hometown, Granada, and I have some places that I think you'll like. And he set up flights, which, looking back, are just miraculous. Getting an airplane in Spain is not an easy thing, and it's not cheap. And he'd set up these 2 hours for 2 days, which just happened to follow a week of solid rain, on 2 of the clearest days I've ever seen. And we jumped into this airplane, and I thought they wanted the project in black and white, so I had both cameras. And after 5 or 10 minutes, I just gave up on the black and white. This is impossible. We're passing there is something miraculous every 10 seconds. And with film cameras with 12 exposures, just couldn't keep up. So I just switched over to a digital camera, for one lens, a macro lens that should be good close up and bad at a distance. But I had no choice. And it was in color. And so I just started taking the pictures. And there's a beauty and a precision in them that it can only happen to you by chance. It can only come as a kind of gift. So 2 hours one afternoon, we went to the west of Granada, and 2 hours the next afternoon to the east, into a wasteland. Gaudí's Baza. It doesn't fit my mouth very well, but I just love these pictures. And you know, once you know people well, like I've known Peter McGill forever, and I laid these out on the table for Spain, and the people who are familiar and who are really supposed to know you are shocked. You know that's good.
And I was going to close out the talk by telling you all that you can see the most recent work at St. McGill till January 4th.
That's right. Yeah. Wow. So you see it, which is much better than hearing me talk about it.
I've one question. Can you talk about the relationship between your pictures of Edith and Callahan's pictures of Eleanor, and in fact Stieglitz's pictures of Georgia O'Keeffe?
You know, yes, I can talk about it, but I don't think you're going to get anywhere. One of the images I was looking for in the Gospel of Thomas, and I switched gears because my memory was just on that kind of slippery slope. It's a little expression that says, protect the one you love like the pupil of your own eye. And I had the deepest affection for Callahan, and was, even after Callahan's death, we felt extremely close to Eleanor. And yet, there's nothing in those 4 lives that accounts for our life. The gifts that Edith has made possible for me are irrepeatable and unrepayable. You can see my emotions are coming into the feeling of this, but that's just the way it is. There is something mercurial in her. We met at a YWCA dance on a Saturday night, and my sense that night was, this is the most alive person I've ever met. Well, I didn't know anything about anything then. I was just a kid, in a way, going to business school. Crazy idea. The business school, I can say something about that, was to throw my parents off because they wanted me to be a preacher like my father and to follow him into the seminary, which was not my calling. If you're, you know.
You got kind of close in your own way.
Yeah, that you can't help. That's beyond us. My mother's father was a Quaker minister, which they don't really have ministers, but they're sort of functionaries. I'm not making excuses. I could not possibly have invented the Edith idea without Stieglitz and without Callahan. I was reading the Paul Rosenfeld essay in the American Alfred Stieglitz. The week we went to the beach in North Carolina after we were married. I mean, it's no wonder those words resonate for me still and associate with those first weeks of marriage. there is nothing like the depth of your own experience to wake you up. If that cannot wake you up, I don't know what can. Picture making is about picture making, and it's about the intuitions and skills and compassion directed to the process of picture making. I mean, I can hear Sommer almost pushing us. He says, subject matter is almost harmless. And then scream, and so you think, and I'm speaking from a depth of emotion where it's not harmless, it's life-changing. But you still have all the problems. I mean, probably even when I was in Ohio as a young teacher, I was already saying to students, it's so important to be in love and forget the possibility of being able to photograph love. It just can't be photographed. You've got to live with contradictions. There are dualities that are beyond mending. It's like, here we are in a global warming scenario heading toward rising sea levels and bubonic whatever. And yet they still have a moment for love. I mean, one of Edith's favorite books is Garcia Marquez's book, Love in the Time of Cholera, which just dances around the image of the death of the protagonist and the heroine.
So I think we're going to stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you.